Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Symbolism of Flowers by the Imperator, an article taken from Rosicrucian Digest, Volume 25, Number 5, June 1947. Symbolism of Flowers by the Imperator. We have been told that there is a sermon in stones. There are also stories in flowers. The tales that flowers relate are ones that were first conceived by man. They have come to reflect man's most profound thoughts and transcendent ideals. Botanically, a flower may be but a plant, a bloom of a plant, or the means of its germination. Long before such physical characteristics were understood, flowers were a source of gratification to man's senses of sight and smell. The exquisite perfume of flowers represents one of the two general qualities of the sense of smell. Flowers therefore became the physical ideal of the olfactory sense, symbols of its satisfaction. An harmonious or agreeable state to the sense of smell would be one that is free of offensive odors and obviously would include the aroma of flowers. Other scents are likewise agreeable to man, but not in the same manner as the fragrance of flowers. Psychologically, the aroma of fruits, vegetables, and cooking foods may have a tantalizing appeal. They, however, provide a negative kind of pleasure. They stimulate the appetite, and with its gratification, they lose their appeal. The scent of newly sawed timber or even the pungent odors of a stable may provide satisfactory olfactory sensations to some persons. Such satisfactions, however, are primarily the result or the arousing of agreeable memories, or because the scent falls into a pattern of habitual experience. The fragrance of a flower is abstract. It stands alone for what it is. Its enjoyment is not dependent upon reminding us of something else. The perfume of a spring flower is not less titillating because it is not associated with fond memories. The perfume of a flower, therefore, symbolizes not necessarily particular things or events, but the state of mind of imperturbability, freedom from aggravation. The full gratification of each of our physical senses of perception is not realized in the source of their stimuli, but in the sensations themselves. In the final analysis, it is not what produces pleasing sounds or exquisite fragrance, but the ecstatic experience itself which is sought. The fragrant flower thus can depict an exalted mood or a moment of rapture, no matter what its particular kind. Color being one of the dominant qualities of the physical senses, it is quite comprehensible that man should be attracted by the vivid hues of flowers. Physical beauty is a gratification of the sense of sight. It is what is perceived as an agreement of perspective and of color. Since human vision is capable of discerning varied wavelengths of the solar spectrum, a monochrome existence would produce for us a condition of monotony and ocular fatigue. Certain combinations and contrasts of color consequently become physical ideals because of the satisfaction which they provide. Habit also plays a part in our enjoyment of color. We become accustomed to combinations of colors in our environment, and they become preferred arrangements. Unlike the olfactory sense, the visual one has come to immediately identify flowers with other forms and experiences. The colors of some flowers remind man of the green of the sea, of the pallor of death, and of the fiery heat of the midday summer sun. The coloring and scent of flowers early compelled man's admiration and invited closer examination of them. The symmetry of their form and the geometrical structure suggested order. To man, that which has an easily comprehensible arrangement and uniformity or order is an example of intelligence. The varied structure of flowers, their coloring, fragrance, and the circumstances of their growth serve to objectify or to portray in form man's abstract, spiritual, and mystical ideas. Flowers thus became living symbols of the moral truths of an ever-evolving human consciousness. As Wordsworth said, "To me, the meanest flower that blooms can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears." Any attempt to review, even partially, all the symbolism which has become an accretion of our common flowers would be an arduous undertaking. I have, therefore, selected but three which are particularly rich in meaning. Today they influence alike religion, mysticism, philosophy, and art. The rose. Tradition relates that the ancient Egyptians used the rose as a symbol in their mystery rites and attributed to it a sacred function. It is held that the rose was consecrated to Isis, or the Mother Nature goddess, and was a symbol of regeneration. Nothing has come down in actual inscription from antiquity to confirm this tradition. Since, as we shall see, Egypt has strongly influenced the symbolism of flowers, we shall consider much now related about the rose as having originated there. The rose of Jericho is indigenous to Arabia, Persia, and Egypt. It is actually a small herb of the family Cruciferae. Upon the ripening of the seeds during the dry season, the leaves fall off and the branches curve inward. This causes it to assume a globular shape. When the herb becomes wet, the branches then unfold, and it assumes temporarily the appearance of a living plant. This characteristic caused it to depict resurrection. There is a Haggadic Hebrew legend reminiscence that the rose had no thorns before the fall of man. In this same lore, youth was described as a garland of roses, but age a crown of thorns. The rose is said to have formed part of the bridegroom's garland in ancient Jerusalem. According to halakhic regulations, rabbinical law, the oil of the rose was extracted and used by the upper classes instead of common oil. Rosewater has long been the favorite perfume of the East. In the Sefer HaZohar, book of the Kabbalah, the rose signifies the community of Israel. Its color, which is red or white, has reference to the severity and mercy which alternate in the life of Israel. Its 5 petals allude to the 5 ways of salvation and the 5 gates of grace. It is also related that Maimonides, famed medieval Jewish scholar, used a rose preparation in his diet and prescribed it for others. Finally, the Hebrews ascribed to the rose the symbolism of paradise. Dawn is the reflection of the rose of heaven, as the sunset glow reflects the flames of hell. Ancient Hebraic tradition relates that 800 of these flowers adorn the tent of each pious man in heaven. Grecian mythology recounts that the rose was sacred to the goddess Venus. It was also a palmary symbol of the Thracian mystery school. The mythological account states that the white rose was made red by Cupids, maladroitly upsetting a cup of nectar during a course of dancing before the gods. The Romans honored the rose by naming a state festival after it. Rosalia, or the Festival of the Rose, was in memory of the dead. The catacombs in Rome became symbols of the hopes of future blessedness, because those buried there held such ideas. Subsequently, rose inscriptions on tombs came to represent paradise, or the future life. Among the many titles given to the Virgin Mary in medieval times, we find Santa Maria della Rosa. The rose being consecrated to her, it became, in the Middle Ages, a symbol of virginity. Dante wrote, "Here is the rose wherein the word divine was made incarnate." The Niometria, published in 1614 by Simon Studian, a Rosicrucian, was a chronicle of the first conclave of the Militia Crucifera Evangelica, held July 27, 1586. This conclave was principally formed by Rosicrucians to protect the cross and to prevent it from becoming an instrument for the persecution of the nonconformists to Roman Catholicism. The Niometria has reference to the mystical significance of the rose. In fact, on page 271 of the book, there is an illustration of the joining of the rose and the cross. Accompanying it is the Latin phrase, "Hirecuntis rosa ex quatuor ins parte." The term sub-rosa, under the rosé, came from the fact that the rose had long been a symbol of silence among the mystical sects in the Middle Ages. In the early centuries, after the advent of Christianity into Germany, a garland of roses was suspended from the ceiling of banquet halls and at private gatherings as a reminder not to divulge the conversation elsewhere. Perhaps the rose became the symbol of silence because it locks within its petals the source of its fragrance and some of its most beautiful hues, thus showing that virtue and noble intentions should be carefully guarded. Michael Meyer, Grand Master of the Rosicrucian Order in Germany in the 16th century, made much of the mystical significance of the rose. He spoke of it as the most beautiful and most perfect flower, guarded like a virgin by its thorns. He also said that it abounded in the garden of philosophy, the latter being a poetic name for the order of the Rosy Cross. He contended that as the natural is sweet and fragrant, so the philosophical rose exhilarates the heart and gives strength to the brain. As the actual rose turns toward the sun and freshens with the rain, so the metaphysical rose is nourished in the light until it reaches perfection. The Rosicrucian alchemists often associated the rose with dew, since the Latin word rosa is derived from the word which stands for dew. The rose laced in the center of the cross, which depicted to the alchemists the 4 principal manifestations of nature, namely air, earth, fire, and water, became the alchemical symbol of regeneration. The lotus, Among the flora of Egypt, so we are told by one Egyptologist, the only kind which may be said to be sacred is the lotus. Some of his contemporaries, such as Wilkins, do not agree with him. However, the weight of evidence supports the conclusion that the lotus was a sacred symbol in ancient Egypt. It is prominently displayed in the symbolism of Egypt. From the cup of the lotus blossom, we see issuing the boy Horus, the rising sun, symbol of resurrection. On sculpture and paintings of altars of offerings, we see a profusion of lotus flowers. In the replica of an Egyptian tomb in the Rosicrucian Egyptian Museum, we have a statue of the Nile goddess holding forth a tray of her offerings to mankind. This tray is richly inscribed with fowl and fruits and a bas-relief of numerous lotus flowers. In an early Memphite ritual, there is the salutation, "Hail thou lotus, thou type of the god Nefertem." The lotus, we do know, was symbolic of this god. Plutarch tells us that the Egyptians thought that the sun sprang from the lotus plant. The Egyptians undoubtedly did not believe that the sun came from the lotus flower, but invented this symbolism because of the phenomenon of the lotus opening with the rising sun and closing at sunset. However, many are the inscriptions showing Ra, the symbol of the sun and the eternal creative power of the universe, ascending from the lotus flower in the marshes. Also, a hieroglyphic inscription reads in part, "The lotus at the nostrils of Ra," revealing the association of the two. The lotus came to represent the Upper Nile, and the papyrus plant, the Lower Nile. The two, the lotus and the papyrus, were jointed together in a symbolic device typifying the king's rule over both regions, and the same manner as we would join two flags to indicate political unity of a region. Just why the lotus represented the Upper Nile has not yet been disclosed. The lotus with the papyrus also played a tremendous part in architectural ornamentation and design. Almost all primitive art begins with a copy of the indigenous manifestations of nature: flowers, fish, astronomical phenomena, and animals. The Incas, who lived along the coast of Peru and Ecuador, used the marine motif in their decorations on pottery and in their weaving. Those who lived inland used the animals peculiar to those regions. The lotus and papyrus, being common to the Nile, influenced early Egyptian design in a similar manner. Egyptian columns are in the form of papyrus or lotus stalks, tied at intervals by bands, giving them a fluted appearance. The capitals of the columns mostly follow the form of the lotus, either open or closed. When open, the capital has an inverted bell-like shape. The lotus bud became conventionalized, that is, a balanced geometric design, which was used as a frieze or dado along temple walls or in tomb decorations. It must be realized, of course, that the lotus has various colors. The white lotus was placed upon mummies. The lotus flower upon which the god Horus is always shown seated is the Seshni, meaning white lotus. The lotus is mentioned in the oldest of the Vedas. It is there held to be an emblem of beauty to which the faces of the heroines are compared. In India, it appears on the oldest architectural monuments and as a design in sculpture. In the Atharva Veda, the human heart is compared to the lotus. It is referred to elsewhere as the flower born of the light of constellations. In the Brahmanas, the lotus first appeared associated with the creator in cosmogonic myth. In fact, its relation to the divine birth and creation is most significant. The lotus is further conventionalized as a seat or pedestal upon which divinities are found seated or standing. The most striking example is that of the Hindu goddess Lakshmi. She is always shown either seated or standing on a lotus and holding a lotus flower in each hand. After Buddha became represented in sculpture, his image is continually given as seated cross-legged on a lotus seat, or he is shown standing on a lotus pedestal. The number of the petals vary from 4 to 6. In this connection, we must not omit mentioning the very famous sacred prayer of the Buddhists of Tibet, Om Mani Padme Hum, yea, O jewel in the lotus, amen. To the ancient Aryans, the lotus symbolized superhuman or divine birth. We cannot help but see the similarity of the symbolism of the lotus flower in India and in Egypt. Though the Aryans, on their migration southward from European and Northern Asia into India, undoubtedly introduced the symbolism of the lotus to that land, I do not think it was endemic to them. Since the Aryans divided as an Indo-European people, some finally settling in what is now Iran, their contact with the great civilization of Egypt was inevitable. Just as the Arameans introduced into India a writing which became the Sanskrit language, so in all probability the symbolism of the lotus came to India from Egypt via the Aryans. We have noted how in Egypt the lotus was shown as a seat for the god Horus. Is it just a coincidence that it was likewise shown as a seat for the Indian and Hindu deities? Buddhism undoubtedly borrowed the symbolism from the Aryans. The traditional Indian and Buddhist explanation of the glorious lotus flower is that it appears not to spring from the sordid earth, but from the surface of the water, and it is always unsullied and pure, no matter how impure the water. This symbolizes all first created objects arising from primordial chaos, confusion and darkness. In other words, from out the darkness came light, beauty and form. No matter what one's environment, the spiritual truth latent in one's nature may blossom forth and remain uncontaminated if one turns toward the light. As a symbol of divine birth, the lotus is the commonest symbol in Buddhism. It is always identified with the sun. Undoubtedly, the same natural reason that was the cause of the Egyptians identifying the lotus with the sun caused the Buddhists to do so. The phenomenon of the sun suggested that, symbolically at least, it resided in the closed lotus flower in the underworld at night and was resurrected the next day. In Mahayanist Buddhism, the Buddhist interpretation of theism, or a supreme God, there is a most important sacred scripture known as Lotus of the True Law. It is really a dramatic play concerning creation, much as is our book of Genesis in the Old Testament. As in Egypt, the influence of the lotus on the art of India has been considerable. In Tibetan literature, there are references to the three lotus deities. The lotus order of deities represents the deified principles of certain functions within ourselves. In other words, the lotus deities are but esoteric symbols of certain human capabilities. In the Dhammapada, Path of Law, there is a chapter on the symbolism of flowers and their relation to human virtues and frailties. There are, however, no particular references to the lotus. The lily. Much reference is made to the lily in ancient Egyptian literature. However, it would appear that the lily and lotus are synonymous, because often the same symbolism is attributed to both. We have seen that the lotus is the symbol of the god Nefertem, but we find also the following. The Blessed One rises like Nefertem, like a lily at the nostrils of Ra. He appears on the horizon every day, and the gods are purified by the sight of him. Elsewhere we noted that the lotus also was at the nostrils of Ra. Budge, eminent Egyptologist, in referring to the symbolism of the lily, says lotus or lily, further indicating that they were used synonymously. The lily is also seen as growing out of streams and lakes, with the figures of the four sons of Horus standing on the flower. In The Virgin of the World, a fragment of the lost Trismegistic treatise entitled The Sacred Book and said to have its origin in ancient Egypt, we read, I am the pure lily, carrying forth from the lily of light. I am the source of illumination and channel breath of immortal beauty. This symbolizes, we note, spiritual life, beauty, and illumination. According to mythology, the white lily is fabled to have sprung from the milk of Hera, who was the wife of Zeus. Thus it was a symbol of purity. The Zohar of the Hebrew Kabbalah speaks of the 13 leaves which surround the lily as the 13 attributes of God, which encompass Israel. It likewise mentions that the 5 leaves of the rose are the first 5 words of the Shema, short passages from the Pentateuch. The faces of the righteous are as a lily, we are told. Later Kabbalists used the lily as a symbol of resurrection. The Hebrews held that, as a lily withers in sunlight but blooms beneath the dew, so Israel withers away except as God becomes dew for her. A lily among them is likened to Rebekah, who remained pure amid evil surroundings. The passage in Psalms 130, out of the depth, is explained as an allusion to the lily of the valley. The symbolism of the lily has passed from the Jews to the Christians, and perhaps originally from the Egyptians, if the lotus and lily were held by the latter to be synonymous. The angel of the Annunciation is conventionally represented as bearing lilies. Then again in Matthew 6:28 we find, consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. This is interpreted to mean that Christ was alluding to the fact that no wealth or raiment can make man as beautiful as the real nature of the flowers of the field. The fleur-de-lis, or the emblem of the lily of France, it has been contended, had its origin in the ancient crux ansata, Egyptian looped cross, the symbol of the duality of the forces of nature. The lily has likewise been used for centuries in the coats of arms of Spain and ancient Syria. At least we must concur with Francis Bacon, who said, God Almighty first planted a garden, and indeed it is the purest of human pleasures. It is the greatest refreshment to the spirits of man, without which buildings and palaces are but gross handiwork. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.